The sound of hooves echoed across the cobblestones. Two horses slowly stepped their hooves. On one of them rode a dark-haired, dark-eyed youth of about 15. His name was Likan Vardanaz. Suddenly, a male voice came from the side, announcing that they had almost reached their destination. Before him stood a gigantic gate in a seemingly endless wall. Spires and towers rose at a considerable distance. The Einrogard School of Magic. The speaker was a gray-haired, trim man who served the Vardanaz clan and whose name was Alrong. The man was glad that the young master of the family was able to enter this institution in peace in order to learn to be a great magician. While talking about studying, the young man became immersed in his thoughts and memories. Memories of a past life. The last memory of the young man's past life was his friend and their graduation. And at the same time, all those horrors that they had to endure thanks to good-natured professors. Well, as good-natured. All those tasks that they gave them as training were more reminiscent of bullying and urgent monotonous work dumped on them. Having said goodbye to his friend and to the institute, the young man took a step without looking onto the roadway. And hello, Mr. Truck. The next moment, the young man began to realize that the small childish hands he saw in front of him belonged to him. Or more precisely, he suddenly remembered that he had once been a so-called eternal student. Once upon a time, in another life. In this one, he was Lihan Vardanaz, the third son of the noble family of the Vardanaz magicians in the empire. And the young man was already glad that, being the child of such a rich family, he did not have to do anything, only eat and drink. But everything turned out not to be so rosy. All the property went only to the first son. The remaining children had to take care of their future themselves. True, the family did not abandon their offspring to their fate, but helped them become who they wanted to be in the future, providing them with good teachers and initial startup capital. The first thing Lihan decided to do was to learn the art of the sword. Firstly, aristocrats were supposed to be able to defend their honor, and secondly, the boy himself decided that this could be useful in life. Although their family was a magical clan, he was given one of the most skilled knights of the clan, Sir Alrong, as a teacher. The guy turned out to have a good gift for this. The old knight even suggested that he continue to follow this path. But Lihan considered that it was much safer to be a mage, especially since he himself was from a family of mages. As a result of his choice, the young master of the House of Vardanaz stood before the gates of the largest and most powerful school of magic, Einrogard. The young man still had doubts about whether he would be able to graduate from this institution, since children were not allowed to study magic until a certain age, and therefore he had no idea how gifted he was. But his own father spoke well of his talent. When Lihan went to the Magic Academy, Alrong volunteered to accompany the boy for safety. But they could only go as far as the first gate together. According to the school rules, students had to arrive alone and light. They were not allowed to bring anything they couldn't carry themselves. True, the scene that the young man could see at the reception gates was somewhat different from the rules. There was a crowd of people and carriages around, accompanying high-ranking offspring of various families. At first, Lihan was confused by what he saw, but suddenly a guy nearby started muttering, claiming that it was wrong that his servants were not allowed to go further, and that without his servants he was like without arms and legs. Then he went to one of the teachers who was greeting the future students to voice his complaints. And Lihan began to watch him with interest. What he saw surprised the boy. The teacher raised his wand and activated some kind of spell, which engulfed the complainer in a bright light. After which the boy wandered back with a blank look and muttering something like he was remorseful and sorry for what he had done. And Lihan, to his horror, realized that something from the school of mind control had been used on the student. And the fact that it had been used on the child of a nobleman without hesitation said a lot. It made one think of the many rumors that had been circulating around the academy. But then the reception gates began to open, and a cold voice spoke welcoming words to those who had entered Einrogard, radiating an unimaginable magical pressure. Then the voice expressed displeasure at the fact that the students were not alone, but accompanied, which was contrary to the rules, and a magical wave literally swept away everything unnecessary from the school grounds. On the square in front of the gates there remained only the stunned children of noble families with what they had in their hands, and above them appeared the owner of the voice, a giant glowing skull, who demanded to enter the territory, calling all the students ironheads. Lihan remembered that one of the rumors said that the director of the Magic Academy was a lich. And so began the boys' first day in the greatest magic academy in the empire. As they walked down the corridor, most of the new arrivals grumbled indignantly. Through all the noise, Lihan heard someone calling out to him. Turning around, the young man saw a red-haired girl. She introduced herself as Yona Macon, whose house was also the House of Magicians. Then she said that His Highness the Prince wanted to see him. Looking back, Lihan saw a boy who was dressed the most extravagantly among the students standing. On the one hand, it was strange to hear that the prince wanted to hear him. On the other hand, the Magic Academy was a place to meet and socialize, and also to establish connections for high society for sure. Just like in all families, the royal family inherited absolutely everything only from the firstborn. All the other princes and princesses sometimes had it even worse than Lihan. There were so many of them that even the house with the newly introduced Yona stood higher than most of them. And the guy didn't understand at all, in principle, as did some of the others around him, why she was helping some unknown prince. Having decided to play it safe and not make enemies in the imperial family, Lihan decided to accept the invitation, after which he heard the girl's joyful remark that he was the first one to agree. The prince turned out to be the emperor's 97th child, and his name was Gainando Einregard. It was rumored that he was actually the emperor's first child, but he was adamant about his position. It was understandable why he didn't want to go down to 3 digits, but it still didn't add to his popularity. And it was all because of his immaturity. It took Lihan literally a couple of minutes of talking to him to realize this. The guy was offended by the fact that most people ignored him, despite his belonging to the imperial family. What especially angered him was that most of those who refused to communicate with him immediately tried to talk to the silver-haired girl. The girl's name was Adanarta Einrogard, who was the 44th princess of the empire. Unlike the prince, she had the elegance typical of the imperial family. So naturally, people were drawn to her. In contrast to the princess, Gainando's behavior was absolutely childish. After all, the first thing he demanded from Lihan was to beat those who refused to communicate with the prince. Having somehow convinced the stupid prince to give up this idea, Lihan asked Yona why he was taking care of him. And just as the girl began her explanation, a huge skull appeared in the middle of the corridor, in which the young man easily recognized one of the most terrible monsters of this world, the Lich. The Lich was the result of a great mage's efforts to become undead and escape death, the school principal. The boy had heard that he had a rather bad character. This rumor was immediately confirmed. Looking down at everyone, the skull asked why they thought they were called Ironheads. Princess Adanarta made the assumption that iron is the symbol of this year's newcomers, to which she immediately received the answer that this was correct and the faculty would receive an additional 10 points. The girl was already happy and asked what kind of point system it was, but she immediately received the answer that there was no point system here, and if she wanted to become a magician, she first had to teach her to distinguish truth from lies. This slightly confused the girl. The Lich chuckled and continued to say that iron is a material that changes depending on what it is made of. It is a very valuable material and can be used for many purposes. This explanation made many smile and even become proud, but it was short-lived. Seeing the children's reaction, the skull laughed loudly and, calling everyone fools, explained that the iron symbolized that there was nothing in their heads. Naturally, everyone was outraged by this statement and even began to grumble. But suddenly magical pressure from the school director rolled over them. Under this pressure, it was extremely difficult to move, let alone say a word of protest. To his surprise, he realized that this was not a problem for him. As a member of a magical family, he was exposed to magical aura from his older relatives in one way or another, and even got used to it somehow. As for the director himself, he was surprised to see how one of the students, despite all the magical aura that surrounded everyone present, could calmly look around. And he was very interested in this. After a few moments, the Lich eased the magical pressure on those present and declared that everyone could enter the door on the left. After these words, a door formed in the wall, which began to open by itself in front of everyone. Behind the door, all the students were greeted by set tables and a row of chairs. It was obvious that this was a banquet hall with a welcome dinner. On the tables were many dishes from different cuisines of the world, with a delicious smell floating in the room. Without thinking twice, all the students, tired after the long journey and incredibly hungry, sat down to eat. But as soon as they did this, all the food suddenly became transparent and completely disappeared. And the loud laughter of the director showed that it was his doing. The skull then loudly declared that the academy was the cradle of magicians, and that the strongest impulse in the development of magicians was hunger. After which many objects rained down on the students from above. To their surprise, the young men were able to recognize these items as tattered cloaks and wands, as well as hard loaves of bread and cold rice balls. To this attitude, Gainando declared that it was too much, to which the director, in a very joyful voice, declared that this was exactly the reaction he had expected. And then he told everyone that if the young people were not satisfied with something, then they should study magic and get their own food. If they wanted something, they had to use magic to create it. That was the basic rule of the academy. One of the students thought about it and said that he could just ask his family for everything he needed. Hearing this, the director chuckled. Pleased, he reported that the newcomers were forbidden to go outside. They were also forbidden to ask the seniors for help. Having said everything he wanted, the skull wished everyone good luck, expressing the hope that they would become great mages, and disappeared. And Lihan felt a headache coming on, since he had known such crazy professors from his previous life. As a student before his reincarnation, he remembered that the professor in the neighboring lab had the same glint in his eyes, full of madness. This lich was the same, and it did not bode well. At that moment, Gainando ran up to him and indignantly declared that no one had the right to treat them so badly, because it was simply impossible to wear such disgusting clothes and eat such disgusting food. Lihan muttered thoughtfully that it might not be so bad, since they were given not only food but also clothes. So this place was definitely better. These words greatly embarrassed the prince. In high society, few knew much about the House of Vardanas, as they were completely absorbed in the study of magic and never participated in public activities. Because of this, many misunderstandings accumulated about them. Gainando was perplexed, as even his servants did not live in such conditions. Not knowing what Lihan was thinking, the prince thought that the Vardanas family was so ruthless in raising their children, and sincerely sympathized with him, giving rise to another misunderstanding. Einrogard Academy was famous for accepting students regardless of their status or title, as long as they had talent. However, to prevent conflicts between teenagers, their dormitory was divided into 4 towers, according to the status of the residents. Lihan and Gainando went to their dorm, which was located in the Blue Dragon Tower. In common parlance, it was called the Blue Tower. It was inhabited by children of high birth, famous nobles, and also the children of the emperor. The second tower was the Burning Phoenix Tower. Simply put, the Red Tower. This tower was inhabited by those who dedicated everything to the holy flame. It is a holy and righteous tower where only priests from various religious orders can be present. The third tower was called the White Tiger Tower, or, simply put, the White Tower. It was inhabited by those who came from knightly houses, who had the rage to defeat anything. These people were trained to become magic knights. The fourth tower was called the Black Turtle Tower, or the Black Tower. Here were various commoners, townspeople, servants, slaves, merchants, and new nobles of the lower class. In general, all those who, instead of a long pedigree, had unlimited patience, since they were most often ignored due to their low position. In most cases, the disciples of the Blue and Black Towers did not interact. But for Lihan, they were ideal business partners. However, the latter's attention was a little frightening to the commoners. And just as Lihan was about to approach them to get to know them better, a contemptuous voice came from the side, declaring its incomprehension of why such low-class people were accepted. Looking around, the guy saw that these words were spoken by students from his tower. Fearing that this could interfere with his further interactions with commoners, the boy indignantly addressed the speakers, saying that they were behaving inappropriately, since upon entering Einrogard, the students left behind everything they owned. And now they were in the same positions. This made the teenagers feel embarrassed, ashamed of their words. One of them noticed that Vardanas was right. Upon hearing his last name, the students of the Black Tower, for some reason, instead of expressing their gratitude, reacted somewhat unexpectedly. It felt like his last name inspired fear in those around him. The guy couldn't understand what had caused this reaction and turned to Yona with a question. Did he really look scary? The girl chuckled and shook her head, denying such a possibility. At that moment, Gainando ran up to them, indignant that the two had left him somewhere behind. Seeing the prince, Lihan returned to his question again, why the girl supported someone like him, and she explained that it was all about his mother, who was her distant relative. And she was also rich. Very rich. And she paid a lot of money for Yona to be friends with the prince, At first, Lihan was shocked by what he heard. But then, after thinking for a bit, he decided that he should also become friends with this prince. After a not-so-cheerful greeting from the director, all the students headed to their towers. Once outside the academy building, everyone was surprised by how much territory it belonged to. There were mountains, a lake, and a forest. Looking at all this, Lihan realized that the director was not joking when he said that they should get everything themselves. With such a territory, this was entirely possible. Lost in his thoughts, the guy followed the crowd of students but suddenly realized that everyone had frozen in one place and were discussing something. When he came closer and saw what exactly had confused everyone, he was also stunned. In front of them stood the Blue Dragon Tower, which looked narrow and not very spacious. It even seemed that it would be a bit cramped for so many people. Of course, the children of noble families were a little disappointed, and some were even outraged that their servants lived in more comfortable conditions. But as soon as Lihan stepped over the threshold, something strange happened. The students around him suddenly disappeared, and he found himself alone in a dark space. Suddenly a voice came into his head greeting him. The voice asked where he needed to go, and then Lihan guessed what was going on. As expected, in the Magic Academy, the dormitory was a magic tower. Quickly pulling himself together, the young man asked the voice where he could possibly end up. In response, the approving voice noted that he was adapting quite quickly and was quite smart, unlike the others. Then, an image of a room with a bed appeared in his head, and a voice informed him that right now, the only place he could go was his personal room, and also a lounge for the Ironheads, that is, for the first years. Hearing the remark about now, Lihan asked if there would be access to other places in the future, to which the voice replied that it would. True, some places would be accessible only by knowing their name, while others would require knowledge of something else. Now, by order of the director, there were no other places for the first year to visit in the tower. After thinking for a while, Lihan asked to be sent to the room assigned to him. Sitting in his bedroom, the young man read a small book that was given to every student upon admission, called Einregard. It gave simple explanations of how the academy functioned. From it, the future magician learned that, with the exception of key subjects, the rest of the classes could be chosen by himself. At the same time, it was possible to decide by trying everything for a month. Also from this book, it was possible to learn that the director's name is Osu Gonadales. Having finished reading and closed the book, the young man looked around his room. There was a wardrobe, a desk, a bed. Nothing extra. The room was spacious and bright. In Lihan's opinion, it had everything they needed. However, this was only his personal opinion. The other children of the nobles were shocked by how empty their room was. After thinking for a while, young Vardanaz decided to head to the restroom to chat with the others. Yona was already there. After discussing her financial situation, Lian asked her what subjects she would study additionally. To which the girl replied with a smile that she wanted to study alchemy. Her dream was to establish her own alchemical workshop and supply products to the imperial family, as she had always been interested in alchemy. The girl suggested that the guy run a joint business in the future, since this area was quite profitable. But Lihan did not immediately agree, but only said that he needed to think about it. The alchemy industry in the empire had always been highly competitive and a difficult business, and not a very safe one either. Lihan wasn't sure he wanted to get involved with it. An endless number of guilds fought for market share, using various methods from spreading bad rumors about their competitors to monopolizing the ingredients for elixirs. He was much more interested in some kind of stable work. For example, to become an imperial officer, in other words, a civil servant. In what field exactly it was not important to him, only grades and qualifications mattered. In order not to offend the girl with a quick refusal, he said that he planned to first try out several options over the course of a month and then make a final decision. At that moment, Gainando ran up to them, breathing heavily. With a frightened expression on his face, he began to claim that his room had been robbed, since there was absolutely nothing there. Looking at the prince, the doomed couple sighed, realizing how many difficulties still awaited him in the future. And at the same time, them with him. The next day, Lihan went to class. The first lesson was supposed to be understanding basic magic. This was the main subject in the first year. Looking around, the boy was surprised to find that his classmates looked very unwell, including Yona and Gainando. When he asked what had happened to them, the girl replied that they were all very hungry, and also, since the beds were very uncomfortable, they had not slept well. Lihan, unlike them, felt pretty good, because if you compare it to his past life, everything wasn't so scary. Remembering the training schedule in his previous life, he didn't always have the opportunity to even have a snack. Sometimes one energy bar was his diet for the whole day, which he munched on the run. Therefore, all the students from the Blue Tower, except for Lihan, looked very exhausted after their first night at the academy. The auditorium where the first lecture was held was on the first floor of the main building. And when Lihan approached the door, he saw many students looking into the classroom with horror and fear through the open door from the corridor. And all because there was a troll inside the auditorium itself. Trolls were fierce and dangerous monsters, infamous even to aristocrats who were very concerned about their own safety. And yet, there was a female troll in the audience, dressed in ordinary clothes. With a rather pleasant voice, she greeted the students, inviting them to enter the auditorium. She introduced herself as Professor Garcia Kim. She also noted that she was a half-breed and that she understood the students' fears, but they had nothing to fear since she did not eat people. Then she licked her lips and added in an ominous voice that at least until she got very hungry. After these words, a deathly silence fell over the audience. Some people even fainted. Garcia Kim shook her head and sighed, saying that it was a joke and then added that it was probably not a very successful one. After which the lecture began. Professor Garcia waved her hand and a glowing ball appeared above her open palm. The woman began her lecture by saying that most of them had never used magic before, as it was extremely dangerous, and therefore only adults were allowed to use it. The purpose of her lecture was to explain the nature of magic, as well as to help future mages determine what type of magic they were predisposed to. And she, in turn, would try to help them determine their path. She then asked those present what they thought magic was. Raising her hand, Princess Adenarda suggested that magic was what mages used to change the world to their will. The troll woman praised the girl, also adding that magical energy, also known as mana, is used in this process, the fundamental force for changing the world. And those who entered the academy are talented enough to sense this energy and recognize it. To do this, you will need to use your will to summon magical energy and carefully weave it together, casting a spell. After this, Professor Garcia suggested that everyone take out their wands and try to gather their magical energy. The mana began to spread across the large audience, and the young mages tried to hold it with their wands to prevent it from dissipating. Many found this difficult. The troll woman then told all the students to imagine an image of a ball of light and recite a light spell, after which she activated this spell herself and a bright light spread throughout the entire classroom, which was blinding. Then, all the students began to repeat after her. Li Han mentally repeated to himself the necessary points for activation and also tried to cast a spell. To his surprise, on the first try, nothing happened except for a small explosion and a surge of magical power. To be fair, the other students also failed on their first try. Here and there were pops and small explosions of the spell being disrupted. Groans from the students could be heard from all directions. Suddenly, Gainando's magic went out of control. The inability to control magic meant that mana could harm a student during the training process. It was for this reason that children were not allowed to use magic until they entered the academy. And also for this reason, Garcia Kim was next to them to prevent the consequences of this. At the moment of the prince's spell failure, the woman activated her wand and extinguished the rebellious mana. After the first failed attempt, Garcia Kim asked the students to try again. And then another attempt followed. And each time, more and more students showed signs of mana exhaustion. By the fourth attempt, only 3 students remained, and by the 6th attempt, only 1 remained. That one and only was Lihan Vardanas. The boy raised his hand and asked if he should continue since he was the only one left. Professor Garcia looked at him absent-mindedly and thought. Usually, all the first years would completely use up their mana by the 5th attempt and collapse from exhaustion. But this one continued to remain on his feet. Magical energy was the very force that could change the laws of the natural world. In the East, some tribes called it chi. As a rule, scientists called it ether. For priests, it was represented as divine energy. In general, this phenomenon had many names and was the source of power for magicians. Since it had to be used every time a spell was cast, it goes without saying that young, aspiring magicians often encountered a lack of magical energy. Therefore, the student who did not look tired, despite the large number of attempts, confused the professors, and so she asked him to introduce himself. To which the guy replied that his name was Lihan. The fact that he gave his first name, rather than his family name, endeared him to the professor who saw a student who wasn't trying to stand out. and so her attitude toward the guy immediately warmed up. To figure out what was going on, Garcia asked the guy to extend his palm to her. Taking his hand, the woman decided to scan his mana volume. What the troll woman saw for herself surprised her greatly. The amount of mana in the boy wasn't just large, it was enormous. It was as if a giant ocean had swallowed it up. Garcia suddenly woke up to Lihan calling out to her. The guy asked if everything was okay. The professor decided not to tell everyone what exactly the problem was, and so she said that everything was fine, but the guy should come to her after class to talk. After giving a lecture on the benefits of practicing energy control, Garcia Kim ended the lesson. Standing in the professor's office, Kim Lihan asked her why only he was called. The woman admitted that even before the lectures began, she had heard about the guy from the director of Osu Gun Adults. The guy didn't like this remark at all. His face twisted into a grimace when the conversation turned to the psychopathic lich director. Seeing his face, Garcia laughed and assured the boy that he had nothing to worry about. The students didn't know it, but the director always had a keen eye for people. And every year, to prevent any accidents, he told his professors about the peculiarities of the new students. At the professors' meeting, the director said of Lihan that he had the qualities of a great fool. Of course, one could interpret these words literally and decide that the guy was very stupid. But Professor Garcia did not take these words at face value. In the east of the empire, there was a well-known saying, "What seems like ignorance may be associated with wisdom." And now, looking at the guy, the troll woman came to the conclusion that the director had in mind the qualities he saw in him, thanks to which he would greatly succeed in life. However, the professor could not say this to the guy's face, and so she began to explain what could later lead to problems. When she checked the boy's mana, she found that there was a lot of it. So much that it is difficult to even imagine. The amount of magical energy is a decisive factor for a magician. If there is not enough of it, you have to use intricate methods to draw out more. Having a large amount of energy, in turn, frees you from such limitations. In other words, the presence of such a quantity of it spoke of the guy's great talent, and this could not but please. But unlike the guy, Garcia wasn't happy. There was a mixture of pity and concern in her eyes as she expressed her sympathy for the guy, which slightly confused him. When he asked why it was bad, the troll woman began to explain, picking up a glass of water. As she said, it was easier to control the water when it was in a glass behind glass. You can pour it into another glass or water the flowers, but it will not be possible to control the whole sea. And even if such a craftsman is found, it will be incredibly difficult. After all, if you water a flower with the whole sea, it will most likely drown and die. The same was true for the boy's gift. The difficulty of managing magical energy in his case was at an unreasonably high level. This news shocked and upset Lihan, as it literally put an end to many of his opportunities. Here Garcia Kim took a bracelet out of her desk drawer and put it on the guy's hand. When Lihan asked why he needed this taming, the woman explained that it was an artifact that had the ability to absorb the magical energy of the wearer. The guy was already happy that this would help solve the problem, but the professor stopped him with the words that he still wouldn't be able to cope with the excess. But it was still better than nothing. Lihan left the office not at all happy. Strangely enough, two people were waiting for him outside the door, Yona and Gainando. They were worried that the professor would eat the guy alone. As he walked to the next lecture hall, he asked his friends if they had decided on their elective classes. The girl admitted that she had already signed up for an alchemy course and suggested that they join her. Lihan thought about this offer because he thought that if he didn't want to become an alchemist, he should at least know how to brew potions for himself. The prince, laughing at Yona's words, declared that alchemy was a job for servants. Lihan watched in horror as the girl curled her fingers into a fist. He, who had studied swordsmanship under the guidance of the family knight Arlong, was well versed in combat. Therefore, he knew that she was preparing to strike Gainando. Lihan quickly stepped back, allowing Yona to stand in front of the prince. And with words that he should not dare to ask her for healing potions in the future, the girl hit the guy with all her strength. Gainando flew back with the blow. It was a really impressive blow. You could say it was a 10 out of 10. In the end, in order not to anger Yanwu even more, Lihan went with her to an alchemy lesson. And the prince went to the infirmary accordingly. As if by chance, Vandanaz asked if it was really possible to beat the guy, since his mother was her patroness. To which she replied that everything was fine, and she would simply apologize to him tomorrow. And Lihan guessed that this was not the first time. The elective classes were taught to all towers at once, since not everyone who wanted to would end up staying for the full course. And along the way, the couple met quite a few students from different dorms, especially from the Black Turtle Tower, who cast fearful glances at the guy. This was understandable since commoners usually had two ways of reacting to nobles, either being afraid and not wanting to associate with them, or showing hostility. In addition to Li Han's status as a noble, there were also rumors circulating around his family, and so the guy simply did not understand how he should communicate with them. While the guy was lost in thought, they arrived at the meeting place. Suddenly, a male voice was heard next to them, asking if everyone was there. After the Lich headmaster and the half-troll professor, the students were already prepared for anything, and so the simple gnome who appeared before them still surprised everyone. Appearing to be a very short, bearded man, the dwarf introduced himself as Professor Yurgulm Gomdar. He then asked the students if they had any idea why the meeting place was not the auditorium, but a clearing in front of the forest. Princess Adenarda stepped forward with the suggestion that they had come here to sense the mana of nature and understand how important it was for alchemy. The girl had always been diligent and smart, and was often praised. So when she heard the dwarf's sharp negative answer, she blushed with embarrassment. Yona, who was next to Lihan, asked the boy what he thought about it, and he said the first thing that came to his mind. If you go to the forest, it means you go to collect. And therefore, they are here to collect materials. They didn't talk too loudly, but Yurgulm still heard them and declared that the guy was absolutely right and praised him. He then began to explain to everyone else that the real reason they had gathered in this place was that the dwarf was going to teach them the most important thing for all alchemists. And it's not the mind and the ability to control mana, which is certainly important. The most important thing for an alchemist, in his opinion, was the collection of resources. This left everyone present a little stunned, as ingredients could always be ordered from others, and so they did not understand how the ability to gather could be the most important. These words angered the gnome, and he even began to shout that they did not understand anything. The thing was that most of the plants could not be grown in the garden, and those that the mercenaries brought were often hopelessly spoiled, since they simply did not know how to collect them correctly. Having caught his breath and calmed down a bit, the dwarf continued that it was for this very reason that every alchemist should know how and where exactly it would be possible to obtain resources. And if they did not learn this, then they would never become great alchemists. The gnome then waved his wand, demanding that they bring him it, and sheets of paper with an image of some strange herb appeared in the air in front of the students. Yona and Lihan sat together and discussed where they could find the defiled grass that was their quest. It was clear that they would have to go into the forest, although they didn't really want to. There were many unpleasant rumors about the academy, including that students died during their training. The guy didn't know whether it was true or not, but he categorically didn't want to go into an unfamiliar forest alone, and Yona agreed with him. The girl offered to join the princess's team, but it turned out to be already full to capacity and would not accept any more people. The guys started discussing other options, with whom exactly they could go. Looking around, it became clear that those who organized themselves into teams immediately went off to search. And those who remained in the clearing were mainly from the Black Turtle Tower. Wondering what to do about the commoner's fear of his name, Lihan looked around and his gaze caught on the dangling keychain. Then he looked at its owner. The owner of the keychain was Nilia, a dark elf from the Black Tower. She was part of the Shadow Watch, a group of experienced hunters and scouts who patrolled the northern ridge and knew the territory like the back of their hand. It was clear that even if she was not familiar with the herb itself, finding the plant for her would still not be difficult. The girl was about to set out on a search when Yona and Lihan called out to her. Nilia knew at first glance that they were nobles and she didn't like it. So when the two suggested going to look for herbs together, she got very tense and asked what they really wanted from her. It was obvious that the girl did not think very highly of the nobles, because from time to time they went up into the mountains and visited their village. And each time they laughed, calling the inhabitants savages, complaining about the bad treatment. When Lihan said again that he just wanted to go into the forest together, since it was dangerous there alone, the elf categorically refused, saying that she did not need their help. Then the boy asked if she was afraid that they would use her as bait, or that they would throw her aside if it became dangerous. This took the girl by surprise because that was exactly what she thought. But she couldn't admit it out loud. The guy's next remark that only real fools would venture into such a dangerous and unknown forest alone made me accept his offer. Yona, on the other hand, stared at Lihan in amazement, wondering what they teach in the Vardana's family. Nelia's movements were light and quick. She walked ahead of the group, opening the way for them, which spoke to how skillfully and experienced she was in navigating the mountains. Yona, who was watching this, asked Li-hun how he knew about the elf's capabilities and abilities. After thinking for a moment, the young man replied that since the girl had well-developed leg muscles and calluses on her palms, this could show that she was a good hunter. And therefore, a good tracker. Hearing this out of the corner of her ear, Nelia was impressed by the young man's insight and was even a little frightened of him. But his next words about it being a joke and him just seeing the Shadow Watch badge on her belt almost made the girl stumble. Seeing her reaction to his words, the young man grinned and asked if she was eavesdropping on them. Naturally, the girl denied everything. Yona then asked Nelia not to rush so much, to which she snapped, asking why she had to adapt to them and not the other way around. To which she received an answer from Li-hun that Yona was the only one among them who could distinguish herbs. There was nothing to say to that, and so the elf, hiding her embarrassment, began to pick on Lian, asking why he was in their group in that case, to which he responded that he was needed for protection. These words made Nelia think, and the girl asked what knightly family he was from and why he lived in the Blue Tower. The guy, with a smile, began to explain that he did not belong to a knightly house and that he was from the Vardanas family. Hearing this name, the dark elf was scared almost to death. Her face reflected immeasurable horror. This reaction slightly offended the guy, and he asked Yona what was wrong with his family. In response, he heard a sympathetic sigh and an explanation that all aristocratic houses have various rumors, but in the case of the guy's house, they are especially unbelievable. When the guy asked what kind of rumors exactly, the girl began to list them. One of them said that the patriarch of the House of Vardanas was a dragon, and during the incident with the mad undead, he burned them to ashes with his fiery breath. There was also a rumor that the boy's bloodline was connected to ancient spirits, which is why the members of the house had incredible abilities in exchange for being deprived of their emotions. And therefore, the family members, according to rumors, knew no pity and always appeared where it was necessary to suppress unrest, wiping out entire cities from the face of the earth. Hearing all this, Li-hun thought that they were considered monsters who would destroy everything in their path. And this was a shame, because in his opinion, all the magic houses did the same. Yona patted Li-hun on the shoulder encouragingly, telling him not to worry so much, and the dark elf, watching how the young mage was getting upset, thought that most likely not all rumors should be believed. At least the rumor that they do not experience emotions was clearly false. Nelia proved to be a truly skilled hunter, gliding through the trees in front of the boys, clearly leading them through the forest. At the same time, she drew their attention to various little things and explained what they could mean. For example, she easily found a barely visible track of a large animal covered in grass. Yon wasn't interested in this, since her only area of interest was alchemy, and the huntress, looking at her, realized that she had gotten too carried away. But Li-hun showed genuine interest in her words. This caught the girl off guard. She didn't quite understand why a guy from a noble family, and a magician at that, needed to know such things, and so she started talking nonsense in a panic. When the girl realized that she was talking nonsense, she quickly pulled herself together, having changed the subject to the fact that, according to rumors, there is quite a variety of fauna living around the school. The girl began to explain that since the territory of Einrograd is rich in magical energy, there could be various types of monsters in this area. And there were also monsters created during experiments and appeared because of discarded elixirs. But these tracks are tracks of ordinary animals, which means you can follow them and thus reduce the chance that they will be attacked from an ambush. After some time, Yona was able to find the defiled grass. True, only 2 pieces, but the girl was optimistic. The future alchemist suggested continuing the search, but when she looked at her 2 friends, she saw that they were frozen in tension. It took her only a split second to realize what was happening. The huge boar looked intently in their direction, and incredible energy emanated from him. Having felt it, Li-hun assumed that it was not just a boar, but perhaps a monster. He probably consumed some kind of elixir, one of those unsuccessful ones that the local alchemist apprentices threw away. The boars themselves were not weak animals, and when strengthened by potions, they were even more terrifying. And he began to move towards the boys. The situation was dangerous, as none of them had weapons with them. Li-hun pulled out his wand and pointed it at the animal. The size of the wand could be changed at the owner's request, and it turned into either a staff or a spear at Li-hun's request. And Nelia remembered that the guy had said earlier that he belonged to the best house of magicians in the Empire. Then she had hoped that the guy had learned a couple of spells before entering. However, the matter was different. When Lihan was 10 years old, he began to learn how to use both a sword and other various weapons. Mages weren't the only ones who could manipulate mana. A swordsman who trained his entire life could coat his sword in condensed mana, and this was called aura. Such a person was Al Rong, his teacher, and he was not one of those trainers who was lenient with anyone during training, forcing them to practice until they passed out. Although Lihan's goal back then was to become a magician and work in the office, and not fight monsters but remembering the experience of his past life, when he had neither time nor money for sports, he was not going to complain, but just continued to practice. And now these efforts are clearly bearing fruit. Swinging with all his might, Lihan drove his staff into the beast's mouth as it lunged at them, piercing its skull from the inside. The vicious boar that had attacked them backed away and fell sideways onto the ground. Both Nilia and Yona froze in shock at what had happened. But what struck the elf most was that the guy, without any magic, simply pierced the beast with his wand. Einregard's wand was very strong and could be used as a club. However, it was impossible to defeat such a boar monster with it alone. At one time, Alrong tried to instill in the boy the basics for developing a sword aura. And now, Lihan got something similar due to the subconscious use of mana. It still wasn't up to the level of an aura mode, but he was starting to get used to this kind of manipulation. Nelia checked if the mutant boar was still breathing. Fortunately, it wasn't. The guy was able to defeat it. Yona breathed a sigh of relief. She found it hard to believe that the professors here would send first years to such a dangerous place. Suddenly, they heard a familiar sound nearby. It was the cry of exactly the same boar. It was hard for the boys to realize that there was not one, but two such dangerous animals in this place. And Leekin slowly began to think about the possibility of abandoning this course to hell. But there was nothing to do, and the guys headed towards the sound. There was exactly the same beast that had encountered several unfortunate students at the academy. The group was quite crowded, and so Lihan suggested not to interfere for now, but simply to watch the ongoing battle. One of their group stepped forward, pointing his staff at the beast. Lihan recognized him as a student from his dorm. The guy's name was Asan Dalkad. If the Vardanaz family had served as advisors to the emperor for many generations, the Dalkad family was primarily responsible for the empire's finances and was well known for its speed and efficiency in work. Asan had a tall and slender figure, yet judging by his stance, he had studied the science of martial arts. The guy pointed his staff at the boar and said that he could easily predict all the movements of this animal. Therefore, it would not be difficult for him to defeat the beast. In principle, this is what happened, and Asan could easily dodge any of his attacks. He was even able to strike the boar's unprotected side. But this blow could not cause the slightest harm, but only enrage the beast even more. As a result of the animal's counterattack, Asan flew to the side and rolled on the ground several times. Then, Princess Adanarta came out against the boar. With a wave of her hand, she ordered the rest of the students in her group to quickly hide behind her. The girl was used to overcoming all obstacles in her path until now, and therefore was determined to deal with the boar in the best possible way. And just as she was about to strike the animals, a loud sound was heard, and then the boar fell to the side. Leon and the girls crept up behind the boar unnoticed, allowing the boy to strike the animal. Adanarta froze in place for a second in surprise, but soon came to her senses. Bowing her head, she thanked the guy for his help and said that she was ready to repay him for it. To which he nonchalantly replied that he was glad to help, but wanted to ask the girl for one favor. She tensed up, because she didn't know what the guy might want from her. And he also carelessly asked the girl to recommend him some classes in which he could easily get good grades. He thought that such a popular person as the princess must have a lot of information on hand. This request confused and perplexed the girl, as it was impossible for her to comprehend that a child from the Vardana's house could ask for something like that. But before she could answer anything, a loud voice was heard from behind, declaring that he knew exactly what kind of object would be suitable for the guy in this case. This voice suddenly sent shivers down Lihan's spine. Suddenly he remembered a professor he had met in graduate school in a past life, and here it was all the same. Behind him, with a terrible expression on his face, stood Yurgulm Gondar, the dwarf alchemist. Somehow, Lihan pulled himself together and didn't let his emotions get the better of him. He was, after all, a seasoned veteran when it came to dealing with crazy professors. With a gentle smile on his face, the boy informed the dwarf that his classes seemed fascinating, but would only be good for those who had enough enthusiasm and passion. Yurgulm chuckled and assured the boy that he would make sure that both enthusiasm and passion would appear in him. This statement caused a feeling of uneasiness in the future magician. He became even more worried when he heard other students whispering behind his back that it was expected that he would become the professor's favorite from someone with the last name Vardanaz. To Lihan's relief, the alchemy professor did not continue the conversation, but merely stated that classes were over for the day and that he was sorry that the other groups had not been able to meet the same boars. Some of the students wondered if the professor had sent these beasts to them on purpose, to which the dwarf responded, confidently stating that a true alchemist must also learn the attendant dangers of collecting ingredients. After all, the real purpose of the lesson was to allow the students to face different situations, and it didn't matter how they would overcome them, whether they caught the boar, went around it, ran away, or hid. The main thing was to be able to cope with such unexpected circumstances. Lihan could almost hear the students scolding him in their heads after the professor said those words. He was also sure that most of those present would not come to further lessons today. Yona was also upset by these words. After all, it turned out that the defiled grass was actually not needed, and the three of them were just looking for it in vain. Hearing that the trio had actually managed to find the required herb, the dwarf was incredibly surprised and happy, stating that they definitely had a talent for alchemy. And then he turned to Lihan again, declaring that after this he simply had to attend his classes. Under such pressure from the professor, Lihan had already half given in, as he realized that it was now impossible to escape. Even if he gave up studying alchemy, nothing good would come of it, as he would offend the professor. Having accepted reality and putting a smile on his face, the guy answered in a monotonous voice that he would try, since he had always dreamed of becoming an alchemist. Yurgulm chuckled, understanding what was going on in Lihan's head. He was the oldest of all the first years present, who knew how to show patience and restraint, hiding his emotions. However, he knew that if he was too persistent, the student would eventually run away no matter what. So it was important to entice him with something interesting. So he promised the boy a special privilege. Not far from the forest, the dwarf had a hut, and Yurgulm told the boy that he could come there whenever he wanted. At first, Lihan didn't like it, because something similar happened in his past life, where he also had to be a cleaner. Seeing the strange expression on the boy's face, the dwarf decided to explain something. And to do this, he asked what, in his opinion, the first years wanted most. Naturally, it was food. This was especially true for the Blue Dragon Tower, where most of the students were used to living in comfort and would not survive long on the food provided by the academy. And the alchemy professor's hut was full of fresh cooking ingredients, as well as spices and vegetables. This is exactly what the dwarf Lian decided to seduce. And at the same time, his two girlfriends. Realizing what the dwarf meant, the boy was delighted. After all, this was essentially a pass to an unlimited buffet, and he could no longer refuse this. The professor and student duo shook hands firmly, sealing the agreement. Lihan decided to immediately take advantage of the privilege given to him and take the boar to the professor's house for cutting, having first made sure that the animal was edible. Yona also decided to help butcher the animal, rolling up her sleeves. However, she didn't look very confident. Seeing that the two were serious, Nelia was surprised. It was strange for her to see that nobles had such skills. Having heard in response that he who does not cut up the meat does not eat it, the elf nevertheless decided to help them. Lihan was glad of this, because Nelia was a professional at this, and Yona came from a house that knew how to handle various materials. Of course, he himself had gone hunting with Alrong many times and learned how to butcher animals, but it would be difficult for him to do it alone. Professor Yurgulm provided the boys with the necessary tools for this, and they got to work. They decided to smoke some of the meat, because no matter how good the weather was, the meat could easily spoil, and smoking was an excellent solution in this case. The dwarf was impressed, as such knowledge and skills were the last thing one would expect from aristocrats. He also provided the guys with the necessary spices and ingredients, and Lihan was able to surprise everyone once again by showing his cooking skills. Considering the food provided by the professor, the table turned out to be simply gorgeous, and for the hungry students, even more so, especially when the gnome shared a jar of jam with them. Tasty cooked meat, bread with butter and jam, and a beautiful landscape helped restore the students' mental and physical strength. The third day flew by in one breath. The boar they caught was terribly large, and even after they smoked a huge amount of meat, there was still a lot left over. Lihan and Yona began to ponder what to do with the leftovers. Throwing away food in their conditions was a complete waste. Looking at them, Nelia wondered if they weren't going to share all this with their friends in the tower. Hearing her question, the two immediately made a decision about their shares of the meat. Both clearly decided that they could sell it all to their classmates. Lihan's motto in this life was, "Work like a horse to live in abundance." Yona's motto was, "Save every coin for the workshop." This was what made them different from other aristocrats, but the elf simply could not know about it. She had already decided to share the meat with the guys from her tower. They were probably hungry by now, and giving them some meat would be a great way to make friends with them. Sitting to the side, the contented, well-fed gnome smiled, looking at everything that was happening. He had already realized that the three students standing in front of him were special, possessing both talent and drive. He also realized that they looked like the kind of people you'd expect trouble from, and he was willing to bet anything that they'd give the professors headaches yet. The Blue Dragon Tower was located far from the main building of the academy and always greeted the students with the scent of fresh leaves. Today, however, was a little different. As soon as the students reached the tower, they were greeted by an unusual aroma. On the makeshift grill, Lihan and Yona were grilling meat with tongs in one hand. Looking at the students who had returned, the couple greeted them with a smile. The students of the Blue Tower stood there confused, not knowing how to react to what was happening. Lihan smiled and invited everyone to sit down and eat with them. But as soon as the boys were happy to hear the invitation, the guy added that for this they would have to pay a silver coin from each. Others might have thought the price was too high, since meat was much cheaper outside the tower. But here, everything was different. And so the students agreed without hesitation. The children of the aristocrats were pleased to finally have some roast meat in their diet. And the business couple was pleased that their business was doing so well. Gainando came out of the tower with an exhausted look at the noise in the courtyard. He looked as if he was about to die of hunger. When Lihan invited him to join the meal, the boy didn't have to be asked twice. But as soon as he took hold of the instruments, he was stopped by Lihan, who grabbed his hand. At the prince's questioning look, the young magician explained that all this would cost 1 silver coin. Gainando was very surprised that they were taking money for this, and in response he heard the explanation that the pride of the nobles could not allow them to take something for free. The prince agreed with this in principle, but because of the director he did not have money. Then Lihan took out a paper and pen, telling him not to worry about it, but to simply write his name and the amount owed on the loan agreement. The business couple did the same with the other students. Despite the inflated price, Gainando, like everyone else, signed without thinking. Moreover, he was incredibly touched by such generosity and friendship. And Yona and Lihan smiled at each other with satisfaction. The next day, the first lesson was a subject called Fundamentals of Magical Ethics, which was one of the main classes. Most of the students in the Blue Tower complained about why they, nobles, were taught something like that. It was more suitable for commoners. Suddenly, a greeting rang out in their heads, causing everyone's expressions to freeze. To their surprise, a giant skull was hovering above them from the ceiling. It was the academy's director, Osu Gonadales. Looking around at all the students, the skull was surprised to see that the students didn't look so bad, which meant that they had already managed to get something to eat. Newcomers came and went every year, but the students from the Blue Dragon Tower were always the slowest to adapt. The fastest were usually from the Black Tortoise, followed by the White Tiger Tower. Compared to the others, the Blue Dragon Tower, which was full of their high-ranking nobles who had never done anything difficult in their lives, took the longest to adapt. But these same first years had already managed to adapt. And it was obvious to the director that one person was behind all this. The director's glowing eyes settled on Lihan Vardanas. His intuition had been right about this guy. He knew the boy was different from the other applicants the moment he saw him for the first time. But even he couldn't have predicted how free of prejudice and bias he would prove to be as a student at the Blue Tower. From the director's point of view, freedom of thought was the most important thing a magician should have, and so he put his students in extreme situations. Besides, he found it funny to watch. One of the students asked the director what these classes were for, to which the director asked in a kind voice what the student himself thought about this. The boy answered hesitantly that he had no idea. And then Principal Osu started yelling that it was all about the seniors and graduates who behaved unsightly outside the academy, and the emperor later held the principal responsible for everything. It was for this reason that he made the subject of the foundation of magical ethics mandatory, so that the next time the king's messenger came to talk about the offenders, he would not be able to punish the director for their misdeeds. Having calmed down, he ordered all the students to open their textbooks to the first page and start reading aloud what was written there. And there, in large print, repeating from line to line, was a phrase that sounded like, "I will not harm peaceful residents with magic." At the end of the class, the director announced that he needed 2 assistants for future lectures. He asked if there were any volunteers. As expected, none of the students volunteered. Their eyes darted around, trying not to meet the Lich's gaze. Pleased with the discomfort he was causing the students, the Skull happily announced that if such volunteers were not found, it would be worse for them. Knowing from his past life that the task would most likely be very annoying, Lehan still decided to raise his hand and volunteer. Annoyed that he could no longer enjoy the students' torment, the director turned to the boy and said that he obviously liked to stand out. The same man, with an unperturbed look and a gentle smile, explained that it would be an honor for him to help the professor, whom he respected. Even during Yurgulm's lesson, the boy realized that helping the professor sometimes brings a lot of benefit. But for some reason, the other students decided that Likan decided to sacrifice himself for everyone else. Suddenly, a voice nearby said that he also wanted to volunteer. The speaker was Asen Dalkad. Skull recognized the young man and noted that his family was good at paperwork, meaning he could be useful. Without further ado, the Skull immediately gave the children the task, showing them several sheets of paper. And then he told them that by the next lecture, they had to manually copy all the safety rules so that each student would have a copy. As a result, Lihan and Asen were told to stay in the classroom alone after school to copy down their notes. Asen was already seething with anger and fatigue from this task, still not believing that the director could force them to do such nonsense when it could all be done with the help of magic. Hearing this remark, Lihan thought about it. He was sure that the director was thinking something like, "Use magic if it annoys you so much." The only problem was that they couldn't even use a basic spell to create light, let alone writing magic. Hoping that the Lich still had at least a little bit of conscience, the boy decided to look around the empty classroom for a clue. Seeing that Lihan, instead of writing, began to search the teacher's desk, Asen asked what he was going to do, to which Lihan replied that he was looking for a clue to resolve the situation, and perhaps find something useful for himself. Hearing this, the guy decided to join in and also started searching. After some time, Lihan discovered that one of the director's desk drawers was emitting strong magical power. Having called Asan to them, the two of them decided to open it. When the box was pulled out, a strong magical wave burst out from it, which took the form of a Lich's skull. Lihan guessed that this was just illusion magic. Then, the illusion spoke in the director's voice, saying that since the box had been opened, it meant that those who had been given this stupid rewriting task had finally stopped messing around and started using their heads for their intended purpose. Hearing that the director himself considered the task given to them to be bad, both boys became angry. But realizing that saying anything in this case was pointless, they continued to listen silently. A piece of paper appeared at the bottom of the open box, and the skull continued that it was a first circle spell called low-level manipulation, and that for their own good, they should learn it quickly. After these words, the magic of the illusion dissipated, and the guys were left sitting in bewilderment. Realizing what had just happened here, Asen was ready to explode with anger. He had imagined how he would learn magic under the guidance of a mentor, and here he was being forced to learn it as a means of survival. Burning with righteous anger, he turned to Lihan with a proposal to file a general complaint. But he didn't even turn around to look at him, as he was focused on preparing to learn the spell. When the boy finally paid attention to his classmate, he asked him why he thought that complaining would work against the crazy principal. Having calmed down a little and thought about it, Asen also came to the conclusion that nothing good would come of this. When Asan finally calmed down, Alikan turned his attention to a sheet of paper with instructions on how to use the spell. To activate the spell, the caster's will was needed, followed by chants and gestures. The boys tried again and again to follow the instructions to activate the magic, but nothing worked. As a result, Asan eventually ran out of mana. Lihan realized once again how difficult it was to learn magic. Every time he moved his wand, mana came to him easily, but each time the flow of mana was collected differently. Even the simplest spells required full concentration and practice. Unlike others, Lihan had a huge amount of mana and could continue training without stopping. He finally managed to channel magic through his wand and release mana directly into the feather. For a split second, the guy felt himself resonating with the feather at once, and what had only been lying there until now slowly rose into the air. Naturally, this was not enough. It was still necessary to make it move, and Lihan concentrated on its control. Slowly and deliberately, he tried to direct the pen towards the paper. Suddenly, the feather shot forward like a dart and, breaking the window, flew out of the classroom. Lihan wasn't the most knowledgeable about magic, but he was certain that the low-level manipulation spell was telekinesis magic, not attack magic. There were two difficult parts to this spell. After pronouncing the formula, it was necessary to control the object without stopping and continuing to concentrate. Then, it was necessary to move the object as the user wanted. And this is where the guy failed. Since he had a lot of magic, Lihan tried again. At the moment when the boy was trying to concentrate on moving the pen, the door opened and Director Osu flew in. With his usual noise, he loudly declared that since the guys were able to find a clue, he would do the rest himself with his magic. Lihan lost his concentration in surprise and the pen twitched. At very high speed, it flew straight into the center of the director's forehead. At this moment, Lihan became Asen Dalcot's hero, because in fact he dared to attack the director. The pen never penetrated the lich's skull, but got stuck in the protective barrier. Surprisingly, the director was not angry, but on the contrary, he was happy, praising the children for starting to master the spell faster than he expected. Seeing that he was in a good mood, Lihan decided to take this opportunity to ask the lich if he could give him some advice on how to improve his control. The director said that control was a problem for all newbies, and that he just needed to practice more. Hearing this, the boy sighed with relief, as he was afraid that the whole problem was due to the large amount of mana he had. The next moment, the lich laughed and said that it was not true, and that the hardest part was mastering the spell itself, and control came after 1 or 2 attempts. And since this was Lihan's problem, he himself had to find the answer to his question. Naturally, this answer angered the guy, but he didn't show it, and only thanked the director for the instruction. Initially, the director wanted to irritate the guy, but since he failed, he lost interest in it. In order not to waste time any longer, the mischievous lich told the boys to go to the dining room and used a teleportation spell on them. Literally a second later, Lihan landed alone in the dining hall of the Blue Tower. Asen was not there, as the director had sent him to the medical building to restore his mana. There was no one else in the room, as lunchtime had long passed. For lunch, there was stale bread and cold rice balls, but the guy wasn't upset at all. After all, he still had a supply of smoked meat, which he dried in the smoke. Suddenly, a female voice called his name, and Lihan turned around to see who had called him. It was Princess Adanarta, with long silver hair and an icy expression, who stood at the entrance to the dining room. When the girl came closer, the guy asked how he could help her. In response, she handed him a folded piece of paper, reminding him that he had asked her to make a list of optional items for him. In addition to the required subjects, the students of the academy had to choose other classes at their own discretion. But since they were forbidden to communicate with senior students, there was nowhere to get information about suitable classes. Therefore, Lihan was very happy with such information. True, having unfolded the sheet of paper and started reading the list, the guy realized that it was a list of popular classes, which included, among other things, the basics of alchemy, the basics of dancing, and other subjects for nobles. And this was absolutely not what he wanted. Seeing the confusion in the girl's eyes, Lihan explained that from his point of view, popular subjects were those that were attended by many skilled students. Therefore, it would be difficult to get good grades in them. Unpopular subjects had less competition. Therefore, it would be easier to get good grades there. Adanarta stared at him in bewilderment. She still couldn't comprehend or accept that he was actually looking for easy activities. In that alchemy lesson, she had thought he was the one who best suited the title of nobleman. And now, for some reason, she felt very disappointed. With a heavy sigh, she pulled out another piece of paper which had a list of subjects she wanted to avoid at all costs. That is, a list of unpopular activities. Seeing him, the young man beamed with happiness. First on the list was the basics of fencing. It was rare to see someone entering a school of magic who studied fencing. The same was true for the second subject on the list, which was called the basics of magical combat. The students who came in search of learning the truth of magic were not interested in combat. But Lihan didn't care. He had complete confidence in his swordsmanship and endurance training, having been trained under Alrong since he was 5. The next day, Lihan went to one of the chosen disciplines alone. He tried to invite his friends to come with him, but they all categorically refused, not agreeing with his unusual idea regarding unpopular activities. From his past life, the boy knew that no matter where you studied, the concept of calculation was simply absent from teachers. They knew that students had other subjects for which they also assigned homework, but they genuinely didn't care. So, to excel in the classes he really enjoyed, he decided to take easier subjects so he could know his priorities and make the right decisions. This was a fundamental truth that was used in all educational institutions. Although, when Lihan saw where exactly the audience he needed was, he wondered if it would really be easy. All the inhabitants of the empire knew that one should never thoughtlessly enter the Tower of the Magicians. There were stories of people who nevertheless entered there, getting stuck in the tower for a very long time, and sometimes even dying. And since Einrograd is the embodiment of a magical tower, even the most curious first years rarely explored the school. And now, Lihan was faced with a dilemma. Should he go down the stairs to find the right classroom, or choose another subject to study? Gathering his courage, he took the first step down. As it turned out, the basement wasn't that big. There were classrooms on either side of a large corridor, and no undead or monsters were in sight. But standing in front of the classroom door, the boy had a feeling that something sinister was hiding behind it. Inside the classroom, he saw 3 students already seated in their seats. However, it was clear that they were not as determined to pass the course as he was, as there was fear, confusion, excitement, and anxiety in their eyes. At each student's seat in the classroom, there were strange balls that caught Lihan's attention. Suddenly, a male voice was heard calling everyone to take their seats. The boy was surprised. The professor was sitting in the corner of the classroom, but no one noticed his presence. Pale skin, sharp fangs, and a pair of dark eyes showed that the person in front of the students was a vampire. Since there was such a person as a professor troll, it would not be too unusual for a vampire to work as a professor. The man introduced himself as Vlad Vagrek, a teacher of magical combat. Professor Vlad then pointed to the strange palm-sized balls that lay on the table and explained that these stones were made from soul star ore, which was very sensitive to magical energy. When the stars are in a certain position, they release holy energy, and the star spirit stone absorbs it, becoming ore. The professor then told each student to take a ball and put their mana into it. All of those present were first-year students, and although they were talented, they were not sure that they could do it right. However, despite their initial fears, the balls first began to vibrate slowly and then rose into the air. Seeing how easy it was, Lihan guessed that this was not just a ball of star spirit stone, but some kind of artifact. And most likely, they were created by the professor himself. One of the balls flew up to the ceiling and seemed to fly through it. But it didn't, stopping just before impact. Professor Vlad began to explain to the surprised students that each ball filled with mana is connected to the soul of the filler, so the students can control them. And also, a spell was cast on the auditorium that prevents its destruction. The student who failed to handle the ball was glad about this, since because of him, the office did not have to be rebuilt. However, after this, the ball suddenly fell and hit the speaking student. Also, without changing his face or voice, the professor noted that the spell of indestructibility does not apply to the students, so they must be extremely careful with the balls. He also asked them to try not to damage the balls themselves. Then, on the teacher's instructions, everyone again raised the balloons into the air and began to try to draw a circle in the air with them. The students tried their best to make the artifacts move in a circular path, and although it wasn't perfect, one of them managed to achieve a pretty decent result. But the professor was not impressed by this and simply told him in a calm voice to repeat it again and then again. When Lihan asked how long they would do this, Professor Vlad looked at him in surprise and replied that until they got a perfect circle. Hearing this, the students began to leave the classroom one after another. Then another one fainted from mana exhaustion. As Professor Garcia said, newbies were unable to control their mana and often fainted after using it up. That's what happened to this student. Without looking up from his book, the professor told him to rest and then take up the task again. And then Lihan realized that he would be the only student taking this course. On the other hand, he would have no more competition for a good grade, which is what he wanted. But he decided to clarify the matter by asking how exactly grades would be calculated. To which he received the answer that the student with the highest score would take first place, followed by those with lower scores, regardless of how many students were present in the course. This was exactly what the boy wanted to hear. After all, if he could hold out until the end, he would easily get the highest score. And that meant that this was exactly the subject he was looking for. Luckily for Lihan, he didn't have to worry about running out of mana. He was fine, even as he continued to spin the ball around. And Professor Vlad stared at him, thinking, every year, students would come to him for this class like a tide. But just as quickly, Like a low tide, they would disappear. Last year, there were no students at all. However, Vlad did not care, since according to his contract, he had to teach this course every year and not collect people who wanted to attend it. In fact, every day he sat alone in the lecture hall and left when the class time was over. However, this year, a new and unusual freshman appeared and broke the usual routine. A mature and handsome young man who, judging by his mannerisms and speech, came from a great house. Vlad didn't know how much mana the boy had, but he could easily tell that he was special. And the professor felt that it would be good if he continued to attend his classes. After all, then he would be able to move on to the next level of training. Sitting in the lounge, Leon tried to tell Yona and Ganando about a subject that could easily earn them good grades. He was never usually so kind to others, but for Yona and Ganando, he wanted to make an exception. The girl's face spoke for itself. She was trying to figure out how best to refuse the offer. Ganando, on the other hand, seemed slightly interested. He asked what they had to do in this lesson, and Lihan explained that they draw a circle with a ball in the air. And nothing more. Yona and Ganando stared at Leon, holding their tongues, clearly thinking that this was some kind of scam. Then the girl couldn't resist asking if he was sure that the professor there was real. Then the guy firmly stated that it didn't matter whether he was real or not. The main thing was that he got good grades. Yona was shocked by his attitude, because she always thought that there was hardly anyone among the students who was as reasonable and practical as she was. However, after talking to Lihan, she realized that she was a lizard against a dragon. He was much more obsessed with profit than the girl. Lihan had no intention of forcing his friends to go to class with him. And if they didn't want to, there was nothing to talk about. So he said goodbye to them and headed to his next class. When the couple found out that he was heading to a lesson on the basics of fencing, they were simply horrified. They tried their best to stop the guy, but he was impossible to convince. The training ground was located in the courtyard near the southern entrance to the main building. There were many more students there than Lihan had expected. More than a dozen students were waiting for the professor in the courtyard. The students gathered here were from the White Tiger Tower and were mostly from knight families. Naturally, they were familiar with swordsmanship and took it much more seriously than the others. Being from the Blue Tower, Lihan quickly attracted a lot of attention. And the fact that many people knew which specific house he was from made people think that he was just there to have fun. It was strange for Lihan to hear such whispers from the outside. Most of the students present seemed to be hostile to him. But it didn't matter to him since he could perceive them as little children. Suddenly, someone called out to him in a loud, rude voice. He was a well-built student. He was also an orc, and his bulging muscles were clearly visible through the rags he had been issued as a uniform. The orc walked up to Lihan and looked him in the eye, to which Lihan looked back. As intimidating as the orc looked, Lihan was not a man who was easily frightened. Looking the boy in the face, the orc said that he had come to the wrong lesson, since they were seriously engaged in fencing here, and since Lihan was from the Blue Dragon Tower, he had nothing to do here. Otherwise, he could get hurt. Naturally, Lihan did not take the guy's threats seriously, but only politely thanked him for the information provided, thereby angering the latter. At that moment, someone coughed slightly. The professor arrived and asked if everyone was ready to start the lesson, and it would be great if everyone came up to him. The teacher turned out to be an elf. His voice was soft, but his appearance somehow did not fit into the usual image. His body was covered in scars from his face down. He had prosthetics in place of one arm and leg, and he used his long sword as a cane. The elf introduced himself as Professor Ingerdel. He announced that since the students had decided to attend fencing classes at Einrogard, they were likely already trained in the art. And in his lessons, he would focus on honing their existing skills. Lihan listened attentively to the professor with all the students, when suddenly he felt someone tapping him on the shoulder. He turned his head and saw that it was an elf, just like Professor Ingerdel, but their appearance was the complete opposite. The student had short blonde hair and a handsome androgynous face. He looked like someone who was popular with the girls. He looked much friendlier and more welcoming than the rude orc. And so when he asked why someone from the Vardanaz family had decided to take up this discipline, Lihan did not immediately send him away rudely. Lihan had two goals in mind when he went to these classes. One of them was getting good grades. That was what he told the elf. The second goal was to raise his level of swordsmanship so that he could always defend himself. And to avoid rivalry, the guy decided to keep quiet about it. The voiced reason puzzled the elf, But he extended his hand to Lihan with a smile and introduced himself as Giselle from the House of Morad. Lihan did not refuse the handshake, noting to himself that despite the elf's gentle appearance, his hands were quite calloused, which showed the long hours spent in training. The boys shook hands. House Morad was a strict adherent to their rules and defended the North in harsh conditions, and so they were willing to resort to any means, method, and trick to achieve their goals. There were many rumors about them, as well as about the Vardanas house. But remembering what was said about his family, Lihan decided that rumors were not always true, and perhaps they could even become friends. At home, Sir Alrong taught Lihan the art of the sword called Bluestone. As the name suggests, it is effective and easy to use. But the training was so difficult that the nobles were reluctant to undertake it. However, Lihan managed to master it, because if you convince yourself that you can do it, then you will. Their teacher, Ingerdel, to the boys' amazement, was immediately able to identify his sword style and praised his basics. At first, the elf decided that the guy was from some border knight family, since he used such a style. But when he heard that the guy was from the Vardanas family, he was very surprised. Hearing his last name, the professor wondered why someone from a house of magicians had such a good command of the basics of the sword. At first, Lihan replied that it was a necessary skill for any aristocrat. But seeing how the elf's face changed at these words, the guy decided to add something else to his words. In a calm voice, the young mage told the professor that he thought so at first, but as he progressed in studying the art of the warrior, he realized how profound this art was, so he wanted to continue to learn the way of the sword. A veteran of dealing with countless crazy professors, Lihan said that was the reason he decided to take the class. And he was right. For Ingerdel, possession of the ball was a matter of life and death, and so Lihan's additional answer hit home. He even accidentally said out loud that it was a great answer. Moreover, the professor decided for himself that the boy was more serious about training than some of the White Tower students. And so he promised the boy that he would be completely serious with him in his training. And Lihan regretted giving such a stunning answer. Then, Professor Ingerdel began training his students to the point of death. At the end of the training match, Lihan felt like a wimp. Despite the tough training, with Ingerdel's help, the boy realized that he had to improve many more weak points that the professor unmistakably found during sparring. It was impressive how the professor could identify each student's techniques, because there were hundreds of fencing styles in the Empire, and the elf knew the names of all of them. The professor was incredible. If Alrong was like an unshakable rock, that Ingerdel looked like a stream of water, and this despite his prosthetic arm and leg. Moreover, Ingerdel gave each student personal advice on how to improve their techniques. The professor dealt with everyone present, but for some reason Lihan felt that he had been beaten more than anyone else. The day came to an end with sparring and individual training. Professor Ingerdel was about to finish his classes, but before that he decided to hold one last sparring session, and for this he called Lihan. The guy had already compared himself to a sandbag for the professor, but it turned out that he had not called him to confront himself. The professor summoned a certain Durgu from Choi's house as his opponent. When the student stepped forward, it turned out to be the same orc who had started a quarrel with Lihan at the beginning of the lesson. The boy stared at the orc with a hostile expression on his face, as he had picked a fight with him just because he was from a different dorm. This greatly irritated the young mage. The orc grinned and looked at the boy with hostility. And Lihan wondered why the professor had chosen him out of all the students present. Now that the situation had developed like this, Lihan prepared to spar with this orc. He had no intention of backing down or going easy on him. Lihan didn't like that he was dismissive of his swordsmanship. After all, the time that the boy could have spent playing, he spent learning to fence and getting punched, and all this was done for the sake of moments like these. In fact, Ingerdel chose these two specifically because they turned out to be the most capable in the entire group of first years. It was impossible to master the art of the sword through theory alone. Only by practicing hundreds of times and having real fights could one see the true way of the sword. In order to extract the absolute power of the sword art, it was necessary to use theory as the foundation and understanding and applied skills as the supporting factor. And in Ingerdel's opinion, not only were these two able to reach this stage, but they were also able to place weak traces of magic into their swords, which in turn meant that they were especially gifted as knights. The professor certainly understood that the students of the White Tower had a low opinion of Lihan, who was an outsider to them. However, he hoped that after the two fought, they would forget their hostility towards each other by showing off their skills. After waiting for the two to take their positions, the elf gave the signal to begin the duel. Ingerdell had high expectations for this duel. The Choi House's Moon Peak sword art was fast and clear. At the same time, the Bluestone art, which represented solidity and strength, was in contrast to it. And the professor believed that since these two were absolute opposites, they would have something to learn from each other. After all, that's what opponents are for. Durgu was the first to attack. Having imbued his sword with magical power, the orc tried to hit the guy in the head. Lihan easily dodged the direct attack by taking a step back and forcefully driving his boot into the ground. Then the guy scooped up the dirt with the toe of his boot and splashed mud on the orc's face. He did this in front of his peers, and they were shocked by such a vile method of fighting. Someone even asked the teacher if it was possible to act like that in a duel. But, unlike his students, Professor Ingerdell was simply delighted with these actions. After all, it didn't matter how you achieved victory on the battlefield, by trickery or deception. The main thing was to survive at any cost. For a swordsman who risked his life in battle, only the result mattered. And Lihan understood exactly what these words meant. Durgu, having somehow blinked, was very angry that he had weakened his defense since he had been prejudiced in his thoughts about the enemy's house. Lihan, in turn, was not going to give any slack to the orc who had not yet come to his senses, continuing to attack him again and again. Earlier, he had carefully watched the duel between Durgu and the professor, and, noticing the movements he had seen earlier, the young magician could already imagine what the orc was like. For Lihan, it was necessary to create a scenario in which he would definitely win, and to do this, he did not hesitate to use cunning or deception. Realizing that he couldn't handle the guy's barrage of attacks, Durgu also decided to resort to trickery and broke the distance between them by rolling on the ground. Everyone who was rooting for the orc was shocked by what was happening. How could it be that the noble warrior was lying on the ground? But the professor was delighted and clapped his hands, praising both boys for their resourcefulness. Blood rushed to Durgu's head from anger and humiliation, and he rushed towards Lihan with a cry. And as they say, whoever got angry is the loser. The duel raged with renewed vigor. Both sides were now using mana infusion into their swords. Watching them, Professor Ingerdell thought that these two were even better than he had expected. Durgu demonstrated an unprecedented level of mastery of the art of the Moon's Peak. However, the harder he hit, the faster he used up his stamina. Vardhanaz, on the contrary, remained calm throughout the fight and only responded to his opponent's attacks. Every time Durgu struck, he was able to maintain his speed throughout the entire fight. This was because he absorbed mana into his sword. And thanks to this mana, Lihan was able to track all of his movements, and by blocking and changing their trajectory. In addition, Lihan, being a descendant of a noble family, exuded a cold pressure that only nobles possessed, which also gave him an advantage in the duel, and did not allow the orc to fully concentrate. Lihan, on the contrary, concentrated on taking advantage of the opportunity at any moment and winning this fight. Durgu began to make too many unnecessary movements. Moreover, judging by the mana in his sword, it was obvious that he was approaching the limit of his physical abilities. Lihan, having an infinite amount of mana, could pour it into the sword in huge quantities without experiencing exhaustion. With this situation, the young magician's victory was only a matter of time. Durgu himself had already begun to realize this. He had to constantly move in order to deliver at least one blow to the enemy, and was already beginning to feel tired. But Lihan's defense was impenetrable, as if the orc was trying to pierce the rock with a needle. In addition, the guy did not show that he felt tired. This was also depressing. This damned Vardhanaz blocked all his attacks without changing his expression, as if Durgu was dancing on the palm of his opponent. Naturally, Lihan was also close to the limit of his capabilities, but since the orc did not have much experience, he overestimated the capabilities of the enemy. This was the reason for his defeat. With one powerful movement, Lihan knocked the sword out of Durgu's hands, and then the boy swung his sword towards the orc's throat, although he stopped literally a few millimeters away so as not to harm the student. At this moment, Professor Ingerdell announced that the duel was over and that Vardhanaz was the winner. The elf saw that the strength of the guys was almost equal, and the orc lost only because of the loss of calm and collapsed under the weight of the pressure. He was also worried that, due to his young age, this loss might not have a good effect on Durgu's future abilities, especially considering that Lihan still continued to radiate the energy characteristic of a high-ranking aristocrat. As a conclusion to the fight, the professor congratulated him on an excellent fight, but clarified that the victory was not 100%. He then expressed his hope that the winner would remain humble, and the loser would not stop persevering for the sake of further growth. He then offered to shake hands. Lihan expected that the orc, judging by his character, would not remain silent and would begin to protest. But to his surprise, Durgu was the first to extend his hand for a handshake, stating that it had been a good fight and that he apologized for being rude to him earlier. Lihan was surprised by this turn of events but shook his hand anyway. Later that evening, Durgu was called to the backyard by several other students from the White Tower. Giselle Murad was at the head of those who called. He addressed the orc with the words that he, as a student of the White Tiger Tower, should not leave everything as it was after such a loss. And therefore, he must take revenge. Durgu's expression hardened, and he replied that he had no plans to take revenge, as he had lost because he lacked the ability. The elf sighed, saying that it didn't matter. But the point was that the honor and pride of the White Tower had been trampled because of his loss, and that means the orc had to bear responsibility for this. Durgu frowned. The Morad family had great authority among the knightly houses, and their words had to be listened to. So he wondered how exactly he should answer for his loss, to which, at the elf's gesture, 2 students came out to him and stood next to the orc. And the elf declared that since he lacked abilities, he should win by numbers. At this point, the White Tower students were divided into 2 opinions. Some of them supported Giselle's idea, while others believed that it was going too far. The orc clearly belonged to the latter group, and therefore clearly told the elf that he was against such an idea and would not take revenge on Lihan. Seeing that he had failed to involve Durgu in this matter, the elf called him a coward and said that he would then have to be replaced by someone else. Another student present responded to his words, and the 3 guys headed towards the Blue Tower. Seeing this, Durgu thought that Vardanas was certainly a capable swordsman, but even he would not be able to stand up to 3 against 1. After all 3 were not weak. The knight's honor did not allow him to close his eyes to this situation, and therefore, regardless of what consequences his actions might lead to, he was going to stand on Lihan's side. To do this, he also went towards the Blue Tower, but by a slightly different route. Since he was hurrying as fast as he could, he was confident that he would be able to come to the rescue in time. But when he came out to the noise, to his surprise, he stared at a student from the White Tower lying unconscious on the ground. The other 2 backed away in horror from Lihan. And there was a reason for that. The guy's eyes were glowing, and several small stones were floating around him, one of which had earlier hit the student in the forehead, who was now unconscious. Some time ago, 3 students surrounded Lihan near the entrance to the Blue Tower. They confidently declared that they had come to take revenge on him for his cowardly actions during an honest duel, and that they were going to make sure that the boy could no longer attend this class. These 3 pretended to be tough, and seemed completely unaware of the consequences of their actions. This irritated Lihan, so he decided to scare them a little. Looking at them with a scary face, he asked if they really understood the consequences of doing something like that, regardless of what house it came from. Fear flashed in the students' eyes. They had also heard of the Vardanas family's reputation, but they were still not going to back down. Apparently, they thought that if anything happened, they would be taken care of, and therefore, someone was behind them. Lihan realized that it was impossible to come to an agreement with such people from a logical point of view. So he decided to go the other way and asked them what powerful family had ordered them to come for him. The mention of someone stronger behind the attack seriously alarmed the trio. Realizing that continuing this conversation could leave them in an even worse situation, the students surrounded the boy and began to approach him. The 3-to-1 ratio was not in the Lihan's favor. He thought about it, remembering what Alrong had said about this. It seemed the knight had advised that in this case it was worth running. Lihan agreed with this opinion, but his path to retreat was closed. Looking around, the boy thought of something. Magic. They had only just begun to study it, but he could already somehow manipulate the feather, which meant that he could also do the same with the stones that were lying on the ground. Having imbued them with magic through his wand, Lihan gave the stones the command move, and they burst into the air. His control over the low-level manipulation spell was still not good enough, and he was afraid that it would not work this time. So he was pleased that everything had worked out as expected. The unknown spell frightened the attackers, and the young mage was about to take advantage of this, demanding that they get out of his way, when his concentration as a mage weakened. And at that moment, one of the stones rushed forward, hitting one of the students in the forehead, thereby knocking the guy out. Lihan didn't really intend to attack them, and it was a surprise to him. He simply couldn't control the flow of his mana. But since things had turned out this way, he decided to pretend that the attack was deliberate. Trying to maintain a calm appearance and concentrating the pressure of mana around himself, he told the remaining two in a heavy voice that if they wanted to die, then they should come closer without hesitation. Frightened by the previously unknown spell and the threatening appearance of the guy, they grabbed their comrade and rushed away. Just a moment before this, Durgu appeared in the clearing. Seeing the orc in front of him, Lihan asked him if he had come to fight him too. Sometime later, the two guys were sitting in a clearing by a fire, and the orc was telling Lihan everything that had happened to him after their duel, including who exactly was behind the three sent. The Blue Dragon Tower was different from the White Tiger Tower. All the houses in the Blue Tower were quite powerful, so life there was more like a social event without a clear leader. In the White Tower, a hierarchy had already been formed, at the head of which stood the House of Murad. When Lihan asked to describe their leader, to his surprise he was able to recognize in him the same elf who had come to meet him during training, Giselle Murad. Lihan began to lament out loud that he thought this guy was good-natured, but it seemed that appearances were deceiving, and behind a handsome face there could be an ugly nature. Vardanaz was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't even hear Durga's words about Giselle not actually being a guy. Having more or less assimilated the information about what had happened, Lihan still could not understand why it was necessary to organize this attack. Then the orc explained that the duel was just a pretext, but there were several reasons. One of them was that Lihan was from the Vardanaz house, and by defeating him, Giselle's authority among the first years would greatly increase. Durgu was worried that Lihan would continue to show himself to be superior, and then the students from the White Tower would feel hostility towards him. And Giselle knows perfectly well how to ignite these emotions and direct them in the direction he needs. After parting with Durgu, Lihan, lost in his thoughts, headed to the Blue Tower. Orc sincerely advised him to avoid the subjects that the White Tower students attend. Then Giselle would not be able to do anything to him. In principle, it was a good proposal, but Lihan didn't even think of following it. Firstly, it was quite difficult to find a good subject, in his opinion, and secondly, it was pride. Lihan could not forgive that they dared to play political games with him. When the guy returned to the dorm and opened the door leading to the freshman lounge, he was already seething with anger. And so, pretending to be poor and miserable, he complained to the other students that he was attacked by students from the White Tiger Tower, and all because he was from the Blue Dragon Tower. There was a moment of silence as everyone present took time to digest what they had just heard. But then the silence was broken by angry cries. From all sides came calls to gather in order to go and avenge their classmate. The Blue Tower students reacted much more violently than Lihan had expected. He tried to calm them down so that the situation would not get out of control. In response, the noise only increased and everyone present declared that they could not leave things as they were, since they owed him too much. Moreover, it was also a matter of pride. Lihan didn't know it, but the feud that originally existed between the students of the Blue and White Towers had been going on for quite a long time and was passed down not only from course to course, but also from generation to generation. It is quite natural to hate someone in whom you increasingly see an equal, and so the attack on Lihan served as a trigger. Grabbing whatever weapons they could, the disciples of the Blue Tower, in a righteous thirst for blood, gathered to head for the White Tiger Tower. Suddenly, a male voice called out to everyone, calling for calm. Lihan recognized the newcomer as Asan Dalkad and was glad that finally someone with common sense had appeared. The guy even started to explain that they couldn't rush because all the students in that tower were from knightly families, and if they rushed there headlong, they would definitely lose. Lihan was about to rejoice that everything would work out, but then Asan announced that it was necessary to set up an ambush and attack from there. All Lihan could do in this situation was to let out a heavy sigh, since it was stupid to expect anything serious from such children. And he urgently needed to do something to calm them down and take control of the situation. Taking a deep breath, the boy tried to drown out Asan's scream to draw people's attention to him. He asked everyone to stop, gather themselves, and listen to him. Remembering the pride of the highborn, Lihan began to operate on her, declaring that what had happened was his personal matter of honor, and therefore he would deal with it himself. When others objected that the White Tower disciples were cunning and despicable bastards, he reminded everyone that they were the children of noble families and they should not stoop to their level. The boy's daily actions and unwavering confidence gave strength to his words, and the students began to come to their senses. Lihan then got to his main point, which was also the reason why he brought it up in the first place. He had been mobbed and was afraid that it might happen again, So he called on the others to help each other whenever someone from their dorm was targeted by the White Tower disciples. His proposal managed to calm the students down, and they began to clap their hands in support, expressing their delight at such a proposal. Inner Lihan let out a sigh of relief. Now, if the disciples from the White Tower tried to pick a fight with him again, he could calmly team up with the disciples from his tower. Suddenly, the topic came up that the next mandatory lecture would be held jointly with the students of the White Tower. One of his classmates suggested putting them in their place by wiping their noses by mastering light magic, since he was sure that no one had ever been able to achieve that from them. Lihan's heart suddenly felt heavy as he listened to the conversation. A terrible thought crept into his mind that he was the only one in the tower who had not mastered the light spell. The next day, Yona walked into the first-year lounge doing pull-ups and yawning as she walked. To her surprise, she saw Lihan sitting in a chair with terrible bags under his eyes. Frightened for the guy, the girl asked what had happened to him. In response, she received a confession that he had not slept all night because he had been practicing light magic. And when asked why he was torturing himself like that, he replied that everyone else had said that they had already completely mastered this spell. At that moment, they saw Gainando enter the restroom, acting suspiciously. He furtively took out some sausages on a skewer from his bosom, and looking around to make sure that no one would steal them from him, he placed the skewer in the fireplace over the fire. The prince was so engrossed in this that he didn't even notice how Lihan and Yona approached him. Hearing the guy's voice in his ear, he even jumped in surprise. Alarmed, he asked when the two had arrived. Shaking his head, Lihan explained that they had been there from the start. He then advised him to pull the sausages out of the fire before they burned. More and more students started coming into the lounge looking absolutely awful. Everyone looked tired and extremely hungry. They had only been able to hold on until now because Lihan and Yona had sold them. Otherwise, things would have been much worse. The guy thought about it. It would be hard to get food for everyone, but something had to be done about it anyway. Having failed to come up with anything, they went to the Understanding of Basic Magic lesson. Professor Garcia Kim was an extremely observant being, especially when it came to her students. Therefore, she would immediately sense the change that had happened to them. Firstly, a week after entering the academy, the students were very hungry. And secondly, she felt the tension between the students of the different towers. Because these people were from different walks of life, they competed fiercely. But the competition between the White Tiger Tower and the Blue Dragon Tower was especially fierce. One of the principal's beliefs was that the more competition there was between students, the stronger they would become. However, the troll woman didn't quite agree with this statement, as it caused her some troubles as well. It would be much easier for her if everyone could get along. Having seated everyone and started the lesson, the woman reminded them that last time they studied light magic and asked if anyone had been able to handle it. Lihan raised his hand to this question. He spent the entire night practicing the spell, as he did not want to fall behind the others. But to his surprise, he found that there were not that many raised hands. In fact, besides him, only one other person raised their hand, namely, Princess Adanarta, and for some reason, she looked at him very coldly. Such an evil look confused Lihan, because the guy did not remember doing anything bad to her. Asen helped to clarify the situation by quietly telling him that it seemed the princess believed one strange rumor that was circulating around the guy. And then he explained that the rumor was that Lihan had come to the academy to laze around, not to explore the world of magic. As he said this, the guy looked very angry, as if the rumor was about him. Lihan, about whom these rumors were circulating, was very surprised. After all, he did not consider this slander, but was simply puzzled by how quickly it became known. And for some reason, Asan was sure that these rumors were started by the students of the White Tower, and he was disappointed that at least someone was able to buy into them. While the guy was blazing with righteous anger, Lihan just shrugged and said that everyone has the right to believe whatever they want. And personally, this rumor doesn't make him hot or cold, and therefore Asen shouldn't bother with it either. Hearing such a statement, the boy was simply at a loss. Although all the students of the Blue Dragon Tower were of noble origin, but in his opinion, Lihan matched this image the most. Noble and magnanimous. And the boy also understood why his family sent him to this academy. It was done so that Asen could meet people like Lihan. Later in class, Professor Garcia asked Lihan and Adanarta to demonstrate a successful use of the light spell. The princess's light ball was a cool blue, while the boy's ball glowed like a small sun. Garcia Kim clapped her hands happily, praising such talented students. After all, Not many students managed to create this spell in their first week at the academy. Then, noticing how sad the other students were, especially the White Tower students, the professor tried to cheer them up and at the same time stimulate them with kind words. She also explained that the light spell was the most basic spell, and it should help them all get their first idea of the elementary magic they would be learning this semester. This news made everyone without exception very happy. Elemental magic includes water, fire, earth, and air, and two more complex elements, darkness and gravity. It also serves as a basis for other types of magic, such as summoning spirits or enchanting artifacts. Summoning her staff into her hands, Professor Garcia announced that everyone would now be tested for the basic element that would best suit them. With the sound of a staff hitting the floor, a candle appeared in front of each student and immediately lit up. The woman explained that they needed to do the same manipulation as in the light spells. Only in this case, they needed to use fire, and therefore they needed to be careful not to get burned. As a demonstration, Garcia activated a flame spell that shot up in a bright protuberance. It was a beautiful but dangerous sight. Then, having extinguished her flame, the woman turned to the students, offering them a try. All the students concentrated and mentally tried to imagine the image of fire. Those who were quick-witted guessed why the professor had given them candles. Lihan was one of them. When the fire was physically closer, it was much easier to visualize it in your mind. He was about to try to manifest fire when he was stopped by Professor Garcia's voice. With a wave of her magic wand, the candle in front of him evaporated, and the guy himself, surprised, froze in place. The woman then turned to him and said that he should refrain from using fire magic, at least for now. The thing was, the element of fire was risky in itself, and Lihan's inability to control the amount of mana he had could put both himself and those around him in danger. Instead of a candle, a copper bowl with water poured into it appeared in front of the guy, and the professor suggested that instead of fire, he practice water magic. Water, like fire, was a basic element, but was not as dangerous. Of course, it wasn't as cool as flame magic or lightning, which could be used offensively, or at least like the magic of earth and metal, which were used for defense. Water magic was controversial, although it had its advantages. For example, he wouldn't have to worry about getting thirsty. Realizing that all this was being done for the safety of those around him, Lihan, in a frustrated state, began practicing with water. True, his concentration was constantly broken by Asan's burning gaze. The guy explained that he was terribly jealous of his friend since he would have individual lessons with Professor Kim. But remembering his studies in his past life, Lihan was not at all pleased with this prospect.